Hello, welcome. This Victorian fantasy castle has been my family's home since the 1890s. We've been hosting guests and providing fabulous hospitality pretty much ever since. The castle is at the heart of a traditional rural estate in Royal Deeside, which is the summer retreat of the royal family and has been so since the time of Queen Victoria. The vast reaches of our surroundings, from mountains to sea, provides endless opportunities for enjoyment. Whether you love hilltop adventures and traditional field sports, or historic sites, galleries and whisky distilleries, the region is bursting with life. We love nothing more than sharing our home with groups of discerning travellers who enjoy the good things in life. Our home becomes yours for the duration of your stay. Our guests are treated to the very best food using local ingredients cooked by our top-class chefs and complemented by a superb selection of fine wines from our cellar. The castle's secluded grounds boast views across the River Dee Valley to the Cairngorms National Park, and our beautiful, tranquil gardens help you feel truly at peace amongst the natural beauty of the landscape. This private, stately home from home, with its grand surroundings, centuries of rich heritage and generous hospitality, allows visitors to be part of a truly remarkable experience, living with the Laird in a real Scottish castle. The remainder of this film will be similar to the talks I give to groups who book tours, so what follows is part garden, part history, and, I hope, wholly interesting and entertaining. While the film is longer than a few minutes, it'll still occupy less of your time than if you actually travelled here to visit. The downside is that you won't be able to taste our superb food, breathe our clean air, and enjoy the peace of this beautiful place. But that again saves your waistline and saves the environment, so please sit back and enjoy. First, a brief history. There's been a garden here since the early 1700s, a little over 300 years ago. The first inkling we have of how it may have looked is from the 1812 map, and there's no resemblance of how things look today. The agricultural revolution had yet to remodel the countryside, and the present Victorian castle was still 80 years away. This circular roundel is really the only recognisable feature that exists today. Roundels are common features of designed landscapes, small groups of trees planted in a round or oval shape, often on a visible location, and surrounded by a low wall. By 1857, the agricultural revolution had happened, and the pattern of fields and woods on this map is pretty much what we have today. The mansion house had been enlarged and the garden developed. The roundel is still evident, but note also the addition of a walled garden. I'll say more about that later. The new approach drives had been formed, and to the east of the house, between it and the roundel, is a shrubbery. Shrubberies were important features of British Victorian gardens where natural planting was favoured over the formal parterres so popular on the continent. This was before the widespread introduction of species from the Orient, and so shrubberies were rather gloomy places, much beset by laurel, box, yew, etc. Shrubberies allowed Victorian ladies to stroll about outdoors on winding paths among the plants for improving walks, and for younger women, shrubberies were approved places for walking with their suitors. The bends in the path around large shrubs afforded brief moments out of sight of the inevitable chaperone following behind for a quick kiss or a cuddle. By the 1890s, the most dramatic change was the erection of the new Kincardine, a glorious arts and crafts fantasy castle, an essay on 500 years of fortified architecture, all built in the space of 2 years. The architect was Sir Aston Webb's chief assistant when he was designing London's Victoria and Albert Museum. Webb later designed other notable London buildings, including Admiralty Arch, the Mall, and Buckingham Palace as we know it today. For reasons of brevity, the castle must remain a subject for another film or talk. The castle was completed in 1896, and my great-grandmother clearly thought about changing the gardens. She was visited by the renowned landscape architect Sir Thomas Mawson, who made an outline proposal to produce plans, and that wasn't accepted. Instead, Aberdeen-based John Alexander Ogg Allen prepared plans for a grand terrace on the southwest facade of Kincardine. That was in 1912, but nothing happened, for in 1914 the world order was more than somewhat overturned by the Great War. The castle became a hospital, not for the last time. My great-grandmother's only son was killed in action, just one of the 21% of all the men of fighting age in this parish who lost their lives in that conflict. It's understandable that plans for great improvement were shelved. The estate was inherited by the only daughter, my grandmother, but as her husband had a large estate in Somerset, Kincardine became simply their holiday home for a few months of the year. In due course, my mother inherited in 1951 during the bleak post-war years, and I took over running the estate in 1979, when I have to say the state of the British economy was hardly any better. It was a rocky start. Annual inflation had peaked at just under 25% and was still very volatile. You could borrow money at 25% per annum, and the top tax rate was 98%. Rents on the estate were subject to the 1915 Rent Act, which effectively froze rents for sitting tenants of unfurnished properties. Thus I found that long-standing tenants were paying the same rent as they'd paid in the 20s, 30s and 40s, the lowest rent being £4 a year. Overall, the estate was in a dire financial position, and for the first 8 years I had to pay instalments of hefty capital taxes for the privilege of inheriting the estate. There was precious little cash or capital to do anything, and so my strategy was more on survival. I have to say that at that time improving the garden wasn't even on the list. I began by focusing on improving the many properties on the estate, and that work is ongoing to this day, but we currently provide over 4.5 times as many affordable rented properties in and around Kincardine O'Neill than does the local council. In 1986, almost by accident, we began hospitality in the castle. That developed, and we found ourselves adding 14 more bathrooms, complying with various regulations for fire safety and so on. And in return, we enjoyed being hosts to famous chefs, leading financiers, superb musicians, and many, many more. Well-travelled leading lights have described our discreet, exclusive-use offering as being world-class hospitality, and of course we cannot disagree, for the customer is always right. In 1983, Leslie Stephen, the gardener, retired from digging the walled garden. I'd kept him on so as not to distress my parents, who had retired to live in the ground floor of the castle. I leased the walled garden to someone who wanted to operate it as a market garden. I thought this was a splendid idea, for I could buy vegetables from him and say truthfully they were from our garden. It was a disaster. He did nothing, and by the end of the 3-year agreement the walled garden was a complete mess. We'd lost the paths, weeds and young trees were growing everywhere where vegetables once grew, and the walls were beginning to deteriorate. It was in 1986, a day I remember quite vividly, that Princess Margaret, when staying with her sister at Balmoral Castle, not far from here, asked herself to tea, you know, the way they do. Anyway, on this occasion, sitting in the great hall, sipping her tea, she asked to see the walled garden. I shook my head and tried to dissuade her, but she insisted, and as I've always been told that when royalty insists you give in gracefully, having warned her of its distressed condition, oft we toddled to the walled garden. We got to the gate. She took one look through and turned to me in that imperious manner of hers and said, You know, you shouldn't have let me see this." I fear I stamped my foot and said, "But damn it, man, I tried to tell you and you wouldn't listen." That evening, my wife Nikki and I concluded that this was somewhere on the scale between a moderately and severely embarrassing incident, and decided there and then that we must do something about the walled garden. So that was the day we added gardening to our list of projects. At first, we had no idea what we wanted. 3 masons spent 3 weeks repairing the wall. Leslie Stephen returned from retirement to establish lawns on the weedy jungles that had been vegetable beds, so that by mowing we could at least control things. We rebuilt the paths, planted hedges so as to divide the garden into rooms, and slowly it came back to life. Progress was slow, as we couldn't afford to pay for much help, and so we did a lot of it ourselves, and still do, though we do now have some help currently in the form of Philippa, Bob, and volunteers, including Liz. I've dedicated the walled garden to Princess Margaret, for without her visit and our consequent shame, we might never have embarked on the project. But I have to say she's also given us 23 years of hard labour and counting. By 2007, having begun to get the walled garden into shape, we started on the Woodland garden, the former shrubbery. It had received some attention from my grandmother and my parents by way of plantings of various rhododendrons and the odd exotic tree. However, having spent the last 28 years trying to save the estate, the castle, and then recovering the walled garden, I'd largely ignored the woodland garden. The trees had grown up so that it was more woodland and less garden. It was time to act. Over the next 2 winters, I personally felled over 150 trees in a thinning operation. Some of them seemed small compared with their neighbours, but were still over 70 foot tall when felled. Others were really quite big, the tallest at 120 feet. Removing these trees was a lot of physical work, but it let the light back into the garden. The existing shrubs, mostly rhododendrons and azaleas, enjoyed that and flourished. We've since added a great many more, so that we now have over 120 varieties of rhododendron flowering sequentially over an 8-month period. The earliest, this rather insignificant rhodo, sometimes flowers before Christmas and continues in bloom until early May. The last flowers in late July or even early August, and it is then but a few weeks before we begin to get autumn colours. A network of grass paths was formed, and these remain neatly mown through the year, while beside them rampant nature competes until, in late summer, I cut back the whole area. I was told years ago that if you have neat and tidy paths, the viewer then concludes the lush growth of wild grasses and herbs is also intended, rather than a sign of neglect. So that's what you're supposed to think too. We first saw sculptures by Lyman Whitaker from Utah when on holiday, not in Utah, and we'd love to have more in due course. People find it absolutely mesmerizing as it moves in the wind. The woodland gardens extend over a couple of acres and blend with the east and west drives, which form part of the designed landscape extending 3/4 of a mile from the castle. Magnificent trees, a blend of conifers and broadleaves, line the drives, and you really only begin to get an idea of the scale of them when someone stands beside the trunk. From the woodland garden we return towards the castle, where at the foot of the tower is a silly little gravel garden. Years ago, standing at this spot, looking across 24 miles of splendid scenery to Lord Byron's dark Loch Nagar, which lies in the heart of the Queen's Balmoral estate, a friend noted you couldn't see a single other building. Owning this, and with that view, he asked, doesn't it make you feel important? And that sparked an idea of making a garden that reminds us all of how very unimportant we are. A philosophical garden, perhaps. The circular millstone nearest us represents the planet Mercury, and beyond it, all to scale, are Mars, Venus, and the Earth. Inside the Earth is the Moon. The edge of the lawn is part of Saturn's vast bulk, and you'll have spotted its rings of box and lavender. Jupiter is here too. Join in your mind's eye the centres of Mercury, Mars, Venus, and the Earth, and you'll find that they're in an arc which shows how big Jupiter is in comparison. Ignoring the Earth for a moment, the Moon and the 5 planets I've mentioned are also the days of the week. The Moon is for Monday, Mars Tuesday, and so on. Where is Sunday? Well, it's here, but you have to walk across the gravel, and there it is beyond the lower lawn. From here, it looks almost like a straight line, but it is so vast that in fact it is a curve representing just one part of the arc of the sun's circumference. Well, I guess you already get an idea that the planet Earth isn't really a very important part even of our solar system. But it gets worse, I'm afraid, because this gravel that makes up much of this garden is symbolic of all the stars in the Milky Way galaxy, except that if we had as much gravel as there are stars in the galaxy, it would be well over my head. And then if I now drop the gravel and just keep one piece, that is now symbolic of the 200 plus billion stars in our galaxy, and the gravel around me is now symbolic of all the other galaxies in the universe. And this little planet that we live on is the only one we know of all of that we can inhabit. And it is our responsibility to look after it, and that is the message of this garden. It's a stupid little gravel garden, but it is one with an important message for all of us. From the planetary garden you can step or even jump across the rings of Saturn. When did you last do that? And head now towards the walled garden. A large berberis marks the end of the bank between the lower and upper lawns, and then we enter the enclosure. In my youth, this area was mown several times a year, and my siblings and I spent many hours raking up the grass and carting it off. In doing so, I suppose we impoverished the ground. I stopped mowing until the autumn, and look what happened. A sequence of wildflowers from wood anemone, orange and yellow hawkweeds, Scottish bluebells, and the like delighted us for much of the summer. We've added daffodils and camasias, and are delighted that wild orchids are moving in. This stone was installed in 2014 to commemorate the centenary of the start of the Great War. The school children that year made a poppy for each of the 63 dead from this parish. Now poppies grow beside it. Finally, we come to the main garden gate, which is a modern feature, installed as recently as 1958, and yes, I'm afraid that is me standing at it. Originally, walled gardens were the food producers for the big houses and not really intended to be visited by the gentry. So, the only gateway on the side nearest the castle was a rather secret one at the top corner. It would have been used by the gardeners to bring fruit and vegetables to the castle kitchen. This gate is where the princess saw inside and expressed her disappointment. I have to say that I'm very sorry I can't show it off to her nowadays, but let's go inside. In a film like this, we could cheat and show you photographs of the borders when each is at their peak, but that would be bending the truth a bit. So here we are, showing you the gardens as they are in early June, and lest we tell you otherwise. When it was growing vegetables, you could walk in and see the whole garden. One of the first things we did was to plant hedges, so now you have to work a bit harder to see the whole place. I talked earlier about restoring the walled garden. The path network was restored to its original layout, and the old fruit trees are about the only survivors from the earlier times. In essence, it's a newish garden within an old frame. Our laburnum walk started as an avenue. But having seen an arched walk in winter at Blair Huon Castle in Ayrshire, we changed our minds. It was planted in 1997. I erected the supporting framework with a little help from my son over the space of a weekend. What we can't show you is the scent, which I can only describe as citrusy. This walk is some 60 yards long, almost exactly the same length as the famous walk at Bodnant Castle in Wales. And this viburnum is also much admired, mainly because of its size. As we walk around the garden, you may have wondered why there are fish scattered about. Some years ago at the castle, we hosted a lecture for charity about garden carpets. We learned then how the oldest walled garden we can identify was built at Pasargadae in Persia by Cyrus the Great back around 535 BC, and how the ancient median for walled around was the word paradisia, which of course is the same word as our paradise. Cyrus was a modest-sounding fellow. In his own words, he said, "I am Cyrus, king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the world." See what I mean? His garden was a 4-part garden, a square divided equally into 4 quarters, a chahad bar, as they call it, built to provide protected relaxation, spiritual and leisurely, in essence a paradise on earth. Isn't that a lovely thought? Cyrus's 4 quarters of his garden were separated by channels bringing water from the distant hills and leading to a central pond. His garden became the basic plan for numerous formal Persian gardens. At the Taj Mahal, each quarter is divided a further 3 times. At this talk, I was struck by the fact that when Kincardine's walled garden was built, they chose an identical layout, but without the need for aqueducts in our rather soggy climate. 2,300 years apart, the design remained the same. The Persians even had carpets woven to illustrate their gardens. In the lecture we were shown this fine example. The plan is the traditional 4-part layout, and you can get an idea of the planting. You can clearly see the water in the channels. We were then shown this beautiful garden carpet, known as the fig door carpet, dating from the mid-17th century. And when I saw this, I was amazed, for here was a 6-part garden carpet. I've told you ours was built as a 4-part garden, but when they built the castle in place of a more modest establishment, they had more staff to feed, and therefore needed a larger garden. So ours became a 6-part garden. You can see in the wall where the brickwork which lines the interior changes. Look carefully at the fig door carpet, and what are these in the water channels? So when the lecture ended, I had but one idea in my mind, that our garden urgently needed fish in its paths, and so here they are. If Cyrus returned and saw this garden, he would totally understand. Before the turn of the present century, we wanted to do something to commemorate the new millennium, so we built this, at the centre of the original garden. On 3 sides, the benches have MM in their backs to remind us why we built it. On the 4th side, we incorporated a gate, made in memory of my wife Nicky's father, who died when she was just 1. She never knew him. However, when Nicky came to Kincardine for the first time, as my girlfriend, way back in 1976, a remarkable thing happened. But first, a little story. My father, a professional soldier, had served in India and the Sudan before World War II and went to France in early October 1939 with the British Expeditionary Force. His battalion, the 1st Black Watch, were transferred from the BEF into the 51st Highland Division the following spring and fought an extraordinarily gallant defensive action in the week after Dunkirk, holding their ground against daily attacks, but having to retreat each night to avoid being surrounded, as the enemy were getting easily through the French lines to their east. It couldn't last, and they had to surrender at St. Valery-en-Caux on the coast of Picardy, and around 8,000 of them were marched off into captivity. My father escaped a week later, while still on the route march, and spent the next 367 days on the run, including getting away from the Vichy French authorities a further 6 times. After travelling nearly 5,000 miles, much of it on foot, he ended up in North Africa, sending home secret intelligence and enduring terrible treatment from the French authorities. Finally, he managed to sail a small boat 700 miles from Algiers to Gibraltar and got home to rejoin the fray. With the reformed 51st Highland Division, he sailed around the Cape of Good Hope for Egypt, fought the entire North African and Sicilian campaigns from before El Alamein onwards, before returning home to join General Staff to plan for D-Day. By the spring of 1944, he was liaison officer to General Omar Bradley, the commander of the US First Army Group, who of course landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day. My father stayed with them at Omaha Beachhead for the next 7 weeks before he was given command of the 5th Battalion, the Black Watch, who was still slogging it out near Caen. He led them with great distinction for the rest of the war as they fought through France, Belgium, Holland, the Ardennes. They led the Rhine crossing and then into Germany. One of the young officers under my father's command was a 19-year-old David Philip Smith. So, on that day in 1976, when I introduced my girlfriend, Nikki Smith, to my father, he was able to tell her, "But I knew your father very well indeed." They'd fought together for 10 months. That little gate has huge significance. We'll head out the bottom gate of the walled garden. I'm sure you know that all walled gardens must have at least one gate at the downhill end. A door won't do, it has to be a gate to let the frost run out, otherwise the wall will keep the frost inside the garden. Here are the terraces of what was once a very early tennis court. Lawn tennis, or spheristeik as it was first called, was patented by Major Wingfield in 1874, and this court came into being within a decade of it. The upper terrace was a croquet lawn. It's a lovely place for weddings and other events nowadays. The Jubilee Diamond was planted to commemorate the Diamond Jubilee in 2012. Himalayan birch are planted in a 7x7 diamond pattern. We can return home via the shrub border, which is on the outside of the walled garden, and in fact you've walked through it already, as it is also the enclosure where you saw the wildflowers earlier on. Note that the exterior of the wall is granite masonry, while the inside is brick lined, so as to ripen fruit more quickly. We actually gave this border a very hard prune back in February of this year, and it's good to see it filling up so quickly. On the right of us is the stump of what was once a magnificent noble fir tree. Sadly, it became unhealthy, and for safety's sake, I had to take it down. The quotation of over £4,000 to fell it shocked me so much that I did it myself with a little help from a cherry picker and Dennis in the tractor with the winch, and much advice from my estate staff who had recently been on a chainsaw course. It'll make a good prey house for quite a few years yet. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I fear I haven't managed in any way to do justice to the sights, to the smells, to the ambience, the sense of place, the peace and quiet of this beautiful place. In the meantime, look after yourselves. Thank you. Bye.